In 2010, an incident occurred at the San Jose mine in Chile that made world history. As a result of a rock collapse, 33 miners were trapped underground at a depth of about 700 meters. They spent a record 69 days in complete confinement, more than 2 months. The rescue operation to extract them was unprecedented in its complexity and scale. And what is most surprising is that none of those trapped underground died during this time. Let's take a look at how this was possible. Northern Chile, the Atacama Desert, one of the driest and most inhospitable places on the planet. In the mining town of Copiapó, thousands of locals are engaged in mining copper and gold in mines located deep beneath the desert. Here, the miners' trade is passed down from generation to generation. Not far from Copiapó is the old San Jose mine. It was modernized, but despite this, it remained an extremely risky facility. It was a spiral mine with a dangerous reputation, so massive and deep that many miners crossed themselves before descending. The total length of the underground passages reached 8 kilometers. After 100 years of almost continuous operation, the mine had become significantly dilapidated, unstable, and potentially dangerous, as evidenced by a series of accidents that had occurred there earlier. The San Jose mine brought in up to $20 million in profits annually and employed several hundred people. But despite the profits, not everyone wanted to work there. The risks were too high. The company had a very peculiar approach to occupational safety. Due to the lack of government oversight of safety, management cut corners on safety measures, putting workers' lives at risk. Mine management preferred to limit itself to formal fines for safety violations, which were occasionally issued by regulatory agencies. Between 2003 and 2010, 3 workers died at San Jose, but major disasters were avoided, until the tragic day of August 5, 2010. On that day, a team led by Luis Urzua went down for another 12-hour shift. None of the miners suspected that something extraordinary was waiting for them ahead. They were working at a depth of about 700 meters, mining gold and copper. Everything was going as usual, with no signs of impending disaster. When the workers gathered near the service trucks to go up to the surface and have lunch, the silence was suddenly broken by a sharp crack. First one, then another, and it all began. There were rumblings, stones began to fall from the ceilings, the walls began to deform and shift, and fragments flew off them. Dust instantly enveloped the entire space, obscuring everything from view. Small stones struck their bodies with force, like sharp needles piercing their skin, causing intense pain. There was a powerful rockfall. The ceiling began to collapse, cutting off the way to the exit. The noise was deafening. At that moment, many miners decided that there was no way out. There was simply nowhere to run. One of the most difficult moments came when a giant rock mass, weighing up to 700,000 tons according to preliminary estimates, collapsed nearby. The dust from the collapse rose so high that it reached the very exit of the mine. When the collapse stopped and the miners came to their senses, they tried to understand what had happened. Moving along one of the walls, they were horrified to discover that all the exits from the mine were completely blocked. A huge fragment of rock, about 150 meters high, had broken off and fallen, blocking all the descent levels. The miners decided to descend even deeper, because at the bottom of the mine, at a depth of about 700 meters, there was an emergency shelter. It was a 20-meter-long concrete container designed to provide shelter in emergency situations. Inside were blankets, medicines, and a box with a limited supply of food. The shelter was designed for 30 people, but this time 33 miners were trapped, 3 more than it was intended for. The men ranged in age from 19 to 60, and they all had to spend more than 2 months there. To survive, they needed a real miracle. Not only did they have to be found at a great depth, but they also had to be brought out. In the first hours after the collapse, no one on the surface knew whether the miners were alive or had died under the rubble. In the evening, relatives and loved ones began to gather at the mine, and by morning the area was filled with crowds of people gripped by anxiety and fear. Rescuers had no accurate information about the depth at which the miners might be located and did not even know if they had survived. The rescue teams that arrived were only able to drive the first 240 meters, then they had to continue on foot. Soon they reached a massive rock that completely blocked the way. However, next to the rubble, they discovered a ventilation shaft, a narrow vertical passage running through the entire mine. This gave them hope. The teams immediately began preparing to descend into the shaft to try to reach any possible survivors. But before the operation could begin, A second collapse occurred, completely destroying the ventilation shaft. After that, the rescuers felt doomed, the mine continued to move, and the risk of new collapses increased. One miner with 25 years of experience said, "I've seen 5 collapses, and not a single one was saved." 2 days later, the head of the rescue operation was supposed to make an official statement and tell the relatives that there was no hope. But instead, he began to cautiously instill hope. A theory emerged that somewhere deep beneath the rubble, the miners could have survived. Despite the high risk of another collapse, the rescuers decided to continue the search. At this time, the miners themselves, trapped underground, were in a state of depression. Many did not believe that they would ever be found. Their despair was compounded by the realization of how deep they were, a journey that had taken more than 100 years to reach this point in the mine. The men were well aware that in order to bring them to the surface, the mine owners would have to spend tens of millions of dollars, and there was no guarantee that they would do so. Few believed in the possibility of a large-scale rescue. Most of the miners were convinced that the search would last only a couple of days for the sake of appearances, and then the mine would simply be closed and symbolic memorial plaques would be installed. However, to their great happiness, their relatives managed to draw the attention of the world's largest media outlets to the tragedy. The story instantly spread around the world, reaching an audience of over 1 billion people. Thanks to this resonance, the rescue operation became the #1 priority for the Chilean government. Rescuers quickly came to the conclusion that if the miners had survived, they were most likely in the lowest emergency shelter. The problem was how to reach it at a depth of 700 meters within a reasonable time frame. The government urgently sought help from leading drilling companies. The most modern and fastest drilling rigs available in the country were assembled and quickly deployed at the foot of the mountain. Drilling began in the direction of the presumed location of the shelter and auxiliary workshops, where survivors could potentially take refuge. But it was almost impossible to reach the exact depth and point. The task was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Meanwhile, underground, the miners' food supplies were rapidly dwindling. Each miner received only a spoonful of canned tuna, a little juice, and 1 or 2 cookies per day. There was no drinking water left at all. In desperation, the miners had to resort to extreme measures. They began to drink water from a technical reservoir intended for drilling operations. It was full of algae and completely unsuitable for consumption. Tension was mounting, and everyone's nerves were on edge. 3 days passed without any news, and many had lost hope. They began to think that their fate was sealed. But suddenly, a faint sound was heard deep in the mine, the knocking of a drilling rig. This was the first glimmer of hope. Someone above was trying to get them out. Drilling continued for several days, and most attempts missed the target. But on August 19, 14 days after the collapse, one of the drills passed just 1 meter from the emergency shelter. The miners heard a loud rumble and thought that the rescuers had finally reached them. Hope flared in their hearts. But soon the sound subsided. The drill passed by without touching the walls of the shelter, and soon everything was plunged into dead silence again. A shadow of despair hung over them, as if death itself was in the air. Over 2 weeks, rescuers made 12 attempts to reach the miners, but all of them were unsuccessful. Relatives on the surface began to lose hope, and even the most resilient began to prepare for the worst. Underground, the situation was critical. Food supplies were running out, and the workers were beginning to starve. On average, each of them lost about 8 kilograms of weight. Time for rescue was rapidly running out. And then, on the 17th day, a miracle happened. The miners heard a sound from above again. It sounded muffled, as if a helicopter was hovering above them. Everyone looked up and froze in anticipation, praying that the sound would not disappear. And suddenly, the drilling rig broke through into the shelter. The joy was indescribable. The men jumped, hugged each other and the drill itself, some unable to hold back their tears. But now there was another question. How to let those above know that the rescue had been successful? The miners began tapping on the metal drill to make a sound that would reach the rescuers. They also painted the tip of the drill with spray paint and attached a note to it. When they began pulling out the drill, the rescuers noticed a change in pressure and realized they had reached a cavity. Then, when they saw the paint and the note, they were finally convinced that they had found the men. The note read, "We are fine. There are 33 of us in the shelter." The note was soon read out solemnly by the President of Chile and instantly became a symbol of the entire rescue operation. It was a moment of true triumph and hope. No one believed that all 33 miners had survived. Emotions overwhelmed not only the rescuers and their families, but the entire country. People cried with happiness, and the news instantly spread around the world. Millions of people followed the events in real time. The rescuers did not waste a minute. Immediately after establishing contact, they laid a telephone line by lowering a cable with a camera into the shelter. Thanks to this, each miner was able to talk to their relatives. Packages with food, medicine, water, and hygiene products were sent through a narrow tube every day. In addition, to ease the psychological state of the underground captives, they were given music players, magazines, books, and other entertainment. According to preliminary estimates, they would have to stay in the shelter for about 3 more months. The rescuers had very little time before they could use a large drill to create a tunnel of the required diameter through which the miners could be evacuated. Every day, the men, who were 700 meters underground, heard frightening cracks coming from the upper levels of the mine. Rocks were falling there. These sounds served as a reminder that another collapse could occur at any moment. In the unstable mine, where the walls continued to crumble, it was necessary to act quickly and find a way to safely extract all 33 people. To solve the problem, a modern drilling rig was delivered from the United States. Its task was to expand one of the existing wells to a diameter of 70 centimeters, wide enough to accommodate a rescue capsule. This capsule was specially designed by the Chilean Navy with the participation of NASA specialists. It allowed miners to be lifted one by one to the surface from a depth at which such rescue operations had never been carried out before. Although 70 centimeters may not seem like such a small size, it should be remembered that these were miners in full protective gear, and the descent was a full 700 meters. This was an absolute record. Never before had people been lifted from such a depth in a single capsule. According to initial estimates, the plan could have taken up to 4 months to implement, but thanks to high-tech American equipment, the process was accelerated by almost half. In addition, just in case, drilling began on 3 independent wells at once, each of which was operated by drilling rigs from different international companies. After 37 days of continuous drilling, carried out around the clock, one of the wells reached its target, the tunnel where the miners were located. It was widened to the required diameter so that the rescue capsule could pass through. The work was completed ahead of schedule. On October 13th, after 69 days underground, the rescue capsule was lowered into the mine for the first time. It reached the shelter, and the first miner climbed inside. The ascent took about 20 minutes. One by one, all 33 men were lifted to the surface. Millions of viewers around the world watched this event live, holding their breath. Within 24 hours, all 33 miners were successfully rescued. The shift supervisor, showing true heroism, was the last to climb to the surface. Addressing those above, including the president of Chile and tens of millions of television viewers around the world, he said, "As promised, I brought out the entire shift." The president, responding with respect and gratitude, said, "I accept the shift. You have fulfilled your duty, like a true captain, leaving the mine last." By October 19th, all 33 miners had been discharged from the hospital. Despite a record 69 days spent in isolation underground, none of them suffered serious physical injuries. Ahead of them lay celebrations, an official reception at the presidential palace in Santiago, a friendly soccer match with the president's team, trips to various countries, and offers to publish books and memoirs. Their story gained international publicity and was later made into a feature film starring Antonio Banderas. Interestingly, the rescue operation itself cost $22 million, while the film's budget was $26 million. All but 2 of the rescued miners sued the Chilean government, accusing it of negligence and inadequate oversight by security services. However, it was never possible to identify the specific parties responsible for the tragedy. Nevertheless, the successful operation became not only an international triumph but also a political event. The Minister of Mining, who took an active part in the rescue, became the most popular politician in the country. The next story I am going to tell you about surpassed even this legendary rescue in terms of scale and emotional tension. It happened quite recently in Thailand. Only this time, it was not miners who were trapped, but children. It all began on Saturday, June 23, 2018. On that day, a 25-year-old assistant coach of the Wild Boars youth soccer team took a group of his players, 12 boys aged 11 to 16, on a trip to the Tam Luang Caves. The children rode their bicycles to the cave. When they reached the entrance, they left their bicycles and some of their clothes behind, took flashlights, a little water, and some light snacks with them, and then set off to explore the underground. The Tam Luang Cave system is the fourth longest in Thailand. It is a complex labyrinth with no mobile phone or radio signal, including GPS. The cave walls reliably block any navigation and communication technology. The lower levels of this system are prone to flooding during the rainy season. There are even special warning signs at the entrance. However, the boys did not pay any attention to this. According to their calculations, there was still plenty of time before the rainy season, and the weather was clear on the day of the trip. Besides, they had no plans to stay long. They were expecting a short walk. But soon everything changed. After the children had gone deep into the caves, the weather outside suddenly deteriorated and a heavy downpour began. Water quickly flooded the entrance areas of the cave, blocking the way back. Cut off from the exit, the boys and their coach began to move deeper into the cave, trying to find a safe place. As a result, they found themselves about 4 kilometers from the entrance. As the water level rose, the passages continued to flood. Eventually, the group found themselves on a small piece of dry land, the only unflooded island deep underground. Between the children and the exit were now several siphons, completely flooded areas from floor to ceiling. It was impossible to swim through them, especially considering that most of the boys had only swum in the school pool before and had no experience of underwater movement in extreme conditions. When the children did not return home, their parents immediately raised the alarm. Bicycles and clothes were found at the entrance to the cave, and it was immediately clear to rescuers that the children were inside. The Thai Marine Corps, an elite unit with excellent training and physical fitness, was called in to assist in the search operation. However, several days of searching yielded no results. As it turned out, the Marines' experience alone was not enough to successfully advance in such conditions. Special cave diving skills and specialized equipment were required. It became clear that the only way to save the children was to bring in experienced professional divers who specialize in underwater rescue operations in narrow caves. One of the experts showed the Thai Minister of the Interior a list of the world's best cave divers. The government immediately contacted these experts and invited them to participate in the operation. Soon, 2 British men arrived in Thailand, experienced cave divers who did this as a hobby. They brought homemade equipment with them, as there was simply no such equipment available commercially. One of them was 57 years old, the other 47. When the Marines first saw these men, they treated them with irony. "Can you 2 amateurs really do what we professionals can't?" But as it turned out, it was these 2 old men from England, as the locals called them, who coped with the task much more effectively than anyone else. Their wealth of experience and highly specialized skills, which even elite military personnel did not possess, allowed them to overcome the most difficult sections of the caves. After beginning their descent, they covered about 200 meters from the entrance and dove into the first underwater chamber, after which they reached the second. There, the water flow was so strong that the murky river practically deprived them of visibility. In addition, the water was full of dangerous objects, old cables, wires, hoses, all of which made it difficult to move forward. Carefully making their way forward, the divers finally surfaced in the third chamber, where they found people. At first, they thought they were part of the missing soccer team, but they were wrong. They turned out to be other rescuers. They had been sent earlier and were trapped after missing the evacuation. Moreover, no one above even knew that they had disappeared. The situation was critical. It was unclear how much time remained before this chamber was completely flooded, a matter of hours, or perhaps minutes. One of those trapped in panic shouted, "We're going to die, we only have 1 tank." But there was no other way out. The divers quickly made a decision. They passed the regulator from one of their tanks and began an immediate evacuation. To rescue them, they had to swim in almost complete darkness, keeping the people as close to them as possible, because the slightest movement could cause the regulator to fall out of their mouths, which would lead to tragedy. During the evacuation of the victims in the third chamber, rescuers faced many difficulties. People in the water bumped their heads on rocks, and divers had to feel their way to find a safe path. Every time it seemed that there might be an air pocket above them, those being rescued instinctively rushed upward, some of them swallowing water in the process. Everything that was happening resembled a tense underwater battle, a struggle for survival in the dark, where every wrong move could cost a life. Nevertheless, 4 people were safely brought out. Each of them had been underwater for at least 30 seconds, and even adults, strong people, were in a state of panic and shock from what they had experienced. Now it was a matter of rescuing a group of children. The English divers quickly came to the conclusion that it would be impossible to simply swim with the children through the flooded areas. It was too dangerous. Even if the children were found alive, getting them out would be a colossal task. It had been 7 days since 12 boys and their soccer coach disappeared in the giant cave complex. Their families were in despair, and the whole country was praying for a happy ending. Meanwhile, the water level in the caves was rising rapidly, 15 centimeters per hour overnight. Conditions were becoming increasingly extreme, but the search continued. Rescuers used powerful pumps to keep the water at bay. The operation was not limited to the cave itself. Everything that was happening resembled a complex organism with many fingers. Some of them were sea lions, others were more than 2,000 soldiers of the Royal Army, and still others were civilian volunteers, doctors, and engineers. It was an operation unprecedented in scale, the likes of which Thailand had never seen before. Volunteers from all over the world took part in it, from Australia, Asia, Europe, and the United States. People came to help from all corners of the globe. At various points, up to 5,000 active participants were involved in the rescue efforts, with a total of about 10,000 people. The whole world watched the operation. The media reported daily from the scene. Water was pumped out by all possible means, with pumps, manually through cracks, directed through plastic hoses, sandbags were installed, and drainage pipes were laid. But despite all efforts, conditions inside the cave remained extremely dangerous and unstable. The monsoon rains came earlier than usual and seemed unlikely to stop for weeks, possibly months. On the 8th day of the rescue operation, almost everyone had lost hope. The possibility that the children were still alive seemed fantastical. Even the American specialists involved in the operation began to lean toward the worst-case scenario. People just sat at the entrance to the cave, waiting for the water level to drop enough to retrieve the bodies. However, despite their despair, the rescuers continued to work, laying cables, pumping out water, checking every passage. Every minute counted. On the 10th day, there was an unexpected breakthrough. The rain temporarily stopped, and thanks to engineering efforts, the water level inside the cave was significantly reduced. One of the rescuers, standing on a section that was knee-deep in water just 4 days ago, said, "It's a real engineering feat. We managed to pump out so much water." This gave the divers a chance to go deeper. One of the golden rules of cave diving is to always maintain continuous communication with the outside world via a rope. This is the only guarantee that you will find your way back. Tam Luang Cave is located under a mountain range, and any mistake could be fatal. On the 10th day, the team of divers managed to reach a crucial intersection, the place where 2 underground rivers converge, flowing towards the main exit. This section was about 800 meters from the 3rd chamber, where a group of people had been found and rescued a few days earlier. The 3rd chamber, although partially flooded, was still dry enough for the sea lions to settle there and set up a base. Almost the entire route from the entrance to this point had to be covered underwater, in complete darkness, with zero visibility. The rescuers wondered where else the children could have found shelter. The only logical option was a place known as Pattaya Beach, the most comfortable and highest part of the cave. That is where the same 2 British divers who had previously found and rescued the stranded rescuers headed. Moving forward, they swam blindly, literally groping their way. When they reached the Pattaya Beach area, each of their hearts skipped a beat with tension, but to their disappointment, there was no one there. The chamber was empty. A dilemma arose: turn back while there was still oxygen left, or take a risk and swim a little further. They knew that their air supply might not be enough for the return trip. And yet, guided by intuition and the desire to see it through to the end, they decided to move forward. And then something incredible happened. Suddenly, a sharp smell, silence, and then, a flash of light. One of the divers immediately took out his camera. The light came from flashlights, and after a few moments it became clear, it was them. All 12 children and their coach, whom the whole world had been searching for. All these days, the children had remained in complete isolation, hungry, exhausted, but alive. All 12 boys and their coach were found alive, and it was hard to believe. One of the divers repeated several times aloud, "Believe it," trying to realize that this was really happening and not a dream. They had really found the children. The first thing the boys asked was if they could get out. However, the divers answered honestly, "Not today." One of them encouraged them, "You are strong, very strong." Then he asked, "Does anyone speak English? I need a translator." This was followed by one of the most frequent responses during the meeting, "We are hungry." One of the children even repeated this several times to make sure he was heard. "We understand," replied the rescuers. They took off their equipment on the other side of the flooded area and approached the children, talking to them encouragingly and trying to cheer them up. Almost every boy came up and hugged his rescuers. At that moment, a real emotional connection was established between them. The divers promised to return. After they got out of the cave, they passed on a note written by the children in Thai. It said, "Right now we need food. We have nothing but water from the cave." All this time, the children drank water dripping from stalactites and tried to stretch out the meager food supplies they had with them for as long as possible. They showed incredible endurance and self-control. Shortly after the British divers left and the footage was released, the world saw the children's video message and their discovery. Millions of people were overwhelmed with emotion, joy, tears, hope. But despite the general excitement, a much more difficult task lay ahead: how to safely bring the children out. Finding them was only the beginning. Now all attention turned to the rescue plan, and the entire responsibility fell on the shoulders of the military. The situation was becoming more and more like a state of emergency. Marines began delivering huge amounts of equipment to the cave, including oxygen tanks and special equipment. The scale of the rescue operation grew dramatically. It was no longer just a search and rescue operation, but a real military engineering operation on which lives depended. It was the 12th day of the rescue operation. There were many people and a lot of equipment on site, but the first group of divers encountered serious difficulties. 4 Marines were sent to provide moral and physical support to the children, equipped with food and rescue blankets. According to the plan, 2 of them were to stay with the children, and 2 were to return. However, 10 hours passed, and no one came to the surface. Soon, a second group was sent to find out what had happened. It turned out that the first team had successfully reached the boys and given them everything they needed, but the divers had run out of oxygen and were unable to return. They were trapped with the children. The authorities began to consider various rescue scenarios. One of them was to leave the children in the cave until the end of the rainy season, but in that case, they would have to wait several months. Another option was to drill new passages in the mountain, but that also took time. The only realistic alternative was to pump out all the water. In a short period of time, more than 1.5 million liters were pumped out, but the water level dropped by only 1 centimeter. The chance of success was negligible, 1 in a billion. Everyone was convinced that the children would not be able to make it through the water. Experience with the 4 adults who had been rescued earlier showed that even they could barely withstand 30 seconds of immersion, and the children would have to spend about 2.5 hours underwater. Nevertheless, someone decided to ask the question, what if we try anyway? The idea of putting the boys to sleep and carrying them through the flooded areas unconscious was even considered, but this plan was immediately deemed insane and rejected. 2 days had passed since the children were discovered, and they still had not been provided with normal food. It was decided to take food from the Americans and try to deliver it to the cave, despite the current and the difficult route. It was a real battle. 2 heavy bags of provisions had to be dragged through narrow passages and flooded areas. However, the task was successfully completed. The children were incredibly happy to see the divers who brought the food. 2 boys were asked to help carefully arrange the provisions. Everything was organized into small, neat piles. Although the food was not particularly delicious, for the children who had been trapped, it seemed like a real delicacy. The divers were shocked by how emaciated the children were. Some coughed heavily, clearly weakened by hunger and dampness. However, despite their physical weakness, none of them cried or panicked. The coach regularly practiced meditation with them. He taught the children to control their breathing and maintain inner calm. This helped them conserve energy and cope with stress. While the children were eating, the divers noticed that the air in the cave had become heavier and more stale. Turning on the oxygen sensor, they saw an alarming level. Only 15%, even though anything below 18% is considered life-threatening. This alarmed the rescuers. It was becoming increasingly difficult to look the children in the eyes. Soon, tragedy struck. One of the participants in the operation, a 38-year-old former Navy SEAL, died from lack of oxygen. He was delivering wetsuits to teach the children how to dive, but on the way back, almost reaching the 3rd chamber, his tank ran out. He was just a little short of saving himself. He was buried with honors, like a hero. Meanwhile, a new threat was looming, intensifying monsoons. It became clear that it was impossible to wait for the end of the rainy season, otherwise the children would simply not survive. On the 16th day, preparations for evacuation began. Medical teams trained in how to carry out the rescue, and at night they prepared sedatives, filling syringes in advance. These drugs had to be administered to the children before immersion to minimize fear and movement underwater. After 2 hours of preparation, in the last chamber before the exit, the divers finally began the most critical part of the mission, the evacuation of the children. All participants knew their roles and strictly followed the pre-planned plan. First, they began preparing the first boy. He was dressed in a wetsuit, given a sedative, and then an injection of a drug to reduce salivation to avoid the risk of choking. Next, ketamine, a universal anesthetic that causes complete loss of consciousness, was injected into his thigh. When the child fell asleep, a breathing mask was placed over his face and he was gently lowered into the water. Then his hands were tied behind his back. This decision seemed harsh, but it was necessary to avoid uncontrolled movements in the narrow, flooded tunnels. This plan, which seemed crazy at first, transporting unconscious children, became the only possible way to protect them from panic in the completely flooded parts of the cave. 2 rescuers swam with each child. In pitch darkness, unable to see even their outstretched hands, they moved forward slowly. Sometimes the children began to convulse, which meant that the anesthesia was wearing off. Then the divers stopped at the nearest air pocket to administer an additional dose of the drug. Other difficulties arose. One boy had difficulty breathing. They had to urgently remove his mask and fix the problem. Another boy's pulse was almost imperceptible. This caused serious concern. Despite everything, the rescuers moved forward step by step. A couple of hours after the operation began, the first boy was taken to the 3rd chamber, where he was picked up by the medical team. He was laid on a stretcher and his pulse was immediately measured. He was breathing. This was a huge morale boost for everyone. It took about 200 people to carry the child from the 3rd chamber to the exit. After the first boy was successfully rescued, the second and then the third followed the same route. All the children who were still unconscious were immediately loaded into ambulances and taken to the hospital. The rescuers were encouraged by the fact that the first 3 boys rescued were alive. Over the next 2 days, 5 more boys were brought to safety. On the 18th day, heavy rain fell, and the threat of flooding returned, so rescuers stepped up their efforts. The last to be brought to the surface was the youngest and thinnest boy, weighing only 29 kilograms. He had a small face, which made it difficult for the breathing mask to fit properly. It was impossible to leave the child underground for another day. The impending downpour could completely cut off the way back. Rescuers tried to put a hood under the mask and tighten the straps more, but they almost broke the child's nose. Then they tried another mask, but it also let water in. In the end, they pulled it on differently, and it stayed on somehow. However, any careless movement could have led to tragedy, so the team proceeded with extreme caution, slowly making their way to the exit. Fortunately, everything went well. Ironically, almost immediately after the last child was rescued, one of the pumps failed and the cave began to flood rapidly. Within a couple of days, it was completely filled with water, but that didn't matter anymore. Everyone was saved. The world rejoiced. The coordinated work of 5,000 people from different countries, cultures, and professions had paid off. A task that seemed impossible had been accomplished. Parents hugged the rescuers, unable to hide their tears. All the boys were severely exhausted but felt satisfied. They were quarantined for a week to make sure they had no infections and were soon released home. In recognition of their courage, the FIFA president invited the children and their coach to the 2018 World Cup final. However, by the time of the World Cup final, the children had not yet been discharged from the hospital. Nevertheless, in October, the rescued teenagers were able to participate in the Youth Olympic Games in Buenos Aires. The story of their rescue attracted the attention of filmmakers. A feature film and several documentary projects have already been made based on it. In addition, Netflix began filming an entire series about the incident, with its premiere scheduled for the end of 2022. After the tragedy, the safety rules for visiting the cave were revised. A year later, it was reopened to tourists, but now access is restricted. Visitors are only allowed to go a short distance into the underground complex, which stretches for 10 kilometers. Previously, access was unrestricted to any depth.